Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Thank you for joining us on the special edition of Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombandra. Now, South Africa, one of Africa's most influential economies, has transformed over the past 2 decades from an apartheid-era isolation to a free, democratic and economically active society. According to South Africa's 20-year review, the country's economy grew at 3.2% a year on average from 1994 to 2012. Join me now from our Cape Town studios to discuss South Africa's industrial competitiveness is Minister Rob Davies, the Minister of Trade and Industry. Minister, thank you so much for making the time to join us this morning. Let's start off with a bit of reflection. 20 years on since 1994. What gains have we made as a country, and in particular, if we look at our industrial policy?
Well, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Well, let me say, first of all, that I think that we need to understand where we came from to understand what progress we've made. This economy was based for the period since the 1880s on the extraction of gold, with the world's largest gold mining industry for many, many years, drawing in large numbers of unskilled, low-paid migrant workers from across the subcontinent. And that economy started to enter into crisis in the 1970s when we started to see the gold mining industry passing its peak, expelling labor from large numbers of people. An industrial sector that existed and grew up was either to feed directly the mining industry or was based on import substitution, industrialization, orientated towards the higher income part of the minority population. And then there were some very serious macroeconomic imbalances as a result of wars, destabilization, and things of that sort at the end of the apartheid period. Now, I think that if we look at where we came from, what we've done is we've stabilized the economy. We've, I think, adjusted ourselves to a very sharp change in the global environment with globalization, with digitization. We have succeeded in laying the basis, I think, for industrial development under very difficult conditions, making transitions from small production lines that were dependent on very, very high levels of protection, such as the case in the motor industry at the end of apartheid, to a more integration model into global value chains, which we have now in the auto sector. But much of the industrial development that we need to bring into being, I think we have begun to identify some of the issues, challenges and opportunities in the last 5 years through our successive industrial policy action plans. And here, I think, under very, very difficult circumstances, we have succeeded in stabilizing, growing industrial output, growing some employment. And the employment is important not just for what the jobs are in manufacturing, but for the job multipliers that manufacturing subsectors have with service sectors as well.
Minister, let me jump in on that note of the Industrial Policy Action Plan. Let's take a step back. You recently launched the 6th iteration of this plan. What's different this time around? And in particular, because you have been quoted as saying that this is a plan with actionable targets and with recognized timeframes. Some of those targets, some of those timeframes, if you will.
Well, I think the important thing about the Industrial Policy Action Plan is it's not a policy framework, it's not a vision document, it is, as its name says, an action plan. So the main feature of it, and we've been issuing them regularly, they cover the financial year in question plus the 2 outer years, is that they deal with targets and work that has to be done by different governmental agencies in accordance with plans which have been developed for the particular sectors or transversely in discussions with stakeholders. That's what it's about. So most of it is a series of actions that have to be undertaken in different timeframes, and this one is no exception. But we also do put in emphases on new policy directions, new things that we need to do in order to step up the effectiveness of our industrial policy. And this particular one, the latest one, is covering this administration, which will be leaving office in a few weeks' time, and the next administration, which will be coming into office in a few weeks' time. And it's identifying some of the things that we think need to happen to raise the impact of our industrial policy. It's talking about things like how we need to accelerate the infrastructure investment program and increase the localization that we have from the infrastructure investment program, how we need to pursue regional integration across the African continent, particularly broadening integration by establishing large free trade areas across large swathes of the African continent and eventually establishing a continental free trade area, but complementing that with infrastructure and cooperation to promote productive industrial activities across the continent.
Minister, one of the key targets, I would assume, of your ministry is the creation of black industrialists. As the economy has transformed, South Africans have not only achieved political freedom but economic freedom too. Let's reflect on that. To what extent has BEE delivered on creating black industrialists in South Africa?
Well, it has to some degree, but I think our conclusion is that not sufficiently. What we really need to create in South Africa is much deeper entrepreneurial capacity, people that are really players in the industrial sectors that they participate in, not people that are sitting on boards and providing general inputs or the PR arm of the boards, but actually the real players in the productive activities of the economy. That's what we really need to create. And there are just insufficient black people that are playing that role, either in big companies, which is one of the concerns that we have about continued fronting in the economy around broad-based black economic empowerment, but also that we have insufficient of the model which you have in Asia, where you have big industrial players working in active symbiosis with small suppliers and working actively to develop the capacities of the small suppliers, build the supply capacity, and create many more opportunities for enterprises at that level. So a lot of our effort has been to try to encourage both of that.
Minister, what about the naysayers that have come back and said, in fact, the unintended consequences of BEE have been so bad that we've not seen a rebalancing of the scales, but a complete skew towards a handful of black insiders who have become the new black elite and have really brought a very negative brand image to the entire exercise? Do we scrap BEE because of these negative and unintended consequences?
Well, absolutely not. I think our focus, as I've already said, our focus is on trying to intervene to support a direction of black economic empowerment where it actually underpins the emergence of people who are real players in the real productive economy, not people that are simply doing a deal and then outsourcing that deal to some subcontractor. That's not the model that I think we want to support. We want to support the model where people are actually real players in the real economy. And most of the changes we've made in BEE as a result of the recommendations of the BEE Advisory Council that sits under the President, most of the changes that we've made have been to try to nudge our empowerment efforts in that direction.
Minister, you talk about real players in the economy, and on the back of that we've heard certain talks of the possibility of a ministry for small businesses. Is this a good idea?
Well, it's not my call, so I'm not going to make any comment on that. It is the call of the President, what ministers he wants to appoint and what responsibilities he wants to assign them. I know there is that discussion, and I can see there is a need for very serious coordination of efforts to promote small business across government. But I think it's up to the President whether he chooses to appoint a minister or not.
Quite certainly, Minister, given the fact that, of course, this has a direct bearing on a very key part of your portfolio, and that is the growth of small businesses. But let's move on and let's look at some of how South Africa has repositioned itself in terms of its trade relations. And let's start off with another piece of legislation, and in particular looking at the draft promotion and protection of investment bill that hasn't really been received with much optimism by international investors in particular. First of all, take a step back. Why this piece of legislation? What benefit does this have for South Africa and investors that the bilateral agreements that existed between South Africa and different countries does not deliver on?
Well, I think we've talked to quite a number of investors as well as governments. I think that the reception to it is not as bad as you make out. But let me just point out by saying that we have had and we negotiated during the period between the democratic government and the constitution. By and large, we negotiated a number of bilateral investment treaties with some countries, but there were plenty of other countries who are investors in the South African economy with whom we have no such treaty. That includes the United States, it includes Japan, and includes a number of other important investors in South Africa. We have no bilateral investment treaty. So what we've been trying to do is we reviewed the bilateral investment treaties. We said, well, really, what are the options? Either we have a law of general application, which provides the sort of protections that we have offered under bilateral investment treaties. We offer it generically across the board to all investors wherever they come from, in accordance with the precepts of the Constitution, which in fact is our supreme law in South Africa. Or we have to start negotiating a ton of bilateral investment treaties with various other players with whom we don't have them. And I think we've opted for the first. While saying that if there's a compelling economic or political case for the negotiation of a particular treaty, we will consider that. But we're also very much aware of the debates that are taking place internationally about the content of bilateral investment treaties and the need for rebalancing of these. And I think that while we've been a bit of a leader in this debate, it's now very, very clear to me that there are many, many people around the world who are thinking again about the nature of the bilateral investment treaties that they're part of, and whether they shouldn't perhaps have something like ours, which is a multilateral, all-encompassing investment law.
Minister, you've indicated that there might be some sort of exemption for certain bilateral agreements where there might be a political imperative to have that exemption. Are there any specific countries that South Africa is looking to sustain its bilateral agreements and maybe not go the multilateral route that you have just explained?
Well, no, I mean, I think what I should say is that what we have done, and this has been where there's been a bit of a controversy, is that some of these bilateral treaties were coming up for either there was an automatic renewal for a period of 10, sometimes 15 years, or we had to take the decision to lapse them, and we took the decision to lapse them. So I think that is where there was a certain amount of controversy in place. However, the protections remain in force under those agreements for another 10 years anyway. And in the meantime, we will develop our investment law. And then I think that what would happen is we have a interministerial committee that has been agreed to by Cabinet, which I presume will continue under the next administration. And that looks at, is there a case? And the case will have to be not that somebody comes and necessarily just asks us for it, but that we can see that there are real investments that perhaps might require us to consider the negotiation of a bilateral agreement on top of the protections provided for under the investment law.
On that note, Minister, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, more on South Africa's industrial competitiveness. That's in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback. So send us an email. That's to investafrica@abn360.com, or interact with us on Twitter using the hashtag InvestAfrica, the handle @CNBC Africa, or follow me @Nozipho Mbanjwa. Still with me, my guest Rob Davies, the Minister of Trade and Industry, joining us from our Cape Town studios. Minister, before we went to break, we were just talking on legislation. Let's pick up from there. There has been some concern that given the electioneering, a lot of pieces of legislation and policy in general is somewhat being lost in the political noise that would ordinarily surround a period of this nature. And in particular, I'm talking about pieces of legislation such as the amendments to the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, which I do appreciate doesn't necessarily fall under your portfolio, the amendments to the Private Security Act, the Intellectual Property Law, and all of these pieces of legislation. How do you ensure that there is some degree of separation between political noise and pieces of legislation that will exist post May 7th?
Well, I think the pieces of legislation in question, I don't know what the last one you mean, because we have a policy discussion document on intellectual property. But there was a law which was passed through on basically indigenous knowledge. But I think that those pieces of legislation were all pieces of legislation that were part of the mandate of this administration. Those passed through Parliament. I don't think they were all passed for electioneering reasons. I don't think anything of the sort. So those pieces of legislation have gone through, and then there will be a new Parliament, a new administration, and there will presumably be further pieces of legislation that will pass. But I think that the real issue from where we stand, which is also some of the parts of the MPRDA amendment, is that really what we need to do in this economy, and looking at the 20-year review, where we've come from, the improvements that we've made in the economic performance, but still a long way to go. And that long way to go requires that we make structural changes in this economy, that we make structural changes which bring value-added activities to the forefront, and manufacturing is key among those. And that's not just a challenge that faces South Africa, it's a challenge that faces the African continent. And so one of the things we need to do is to make sure that we add value to the mineral products that we have under the ground. Industrial minerals are beneficiated to a higher level before we export them, and that we create a real competitive advantage in our country and elsewhere on the continent for manufacturers to come and use those mineral resources to produce industrial goods. That's the challenge that we have, and I think the MPRDA amendment was addressing that. So it's a structural change in the economy that we need to bring about.
Let's move on to the continent and perhaps look at how we've fared if we look at increasing our intra-Africa trade. How's that picture looking?
Well, we are continuing to negotiate the trilateral SADC-COMESA East African Community Free Trade Agreement. We've made quite a lot of progress, but I think that the time frame that was given by the heads of state of 3 years is probably something that we will have to ask for some extension on. Ministers thought it would take between 3 and 5 years, and I think that nonetheless significant, important progress is being made. What we really need to put in place is a large area with a large population, a large GDP, that can support industrial development, not just in South Africa, but across the continent. Many of our industries that are emerging in South Africa, for example, industries that are feeding into our own infrastructure program. And I had an opportunity, for example, to visit a railway manufacturing plant in South Africa, also active on the African continent, producing highly competitive goods that can supply not just ourselves, but also the African continent. And then the African continent also wants to industrialize, and we need to position ourselves so that we are occupying a place in the value chain that is commensurate with our industrial capabilities, but also does allow other countries to industrialize as well. That's going to be the challenge in the trade negotiation, but it's one that we're rising towards. And we're also saying that our approach to regional integration is not just that we have a trade integration, but it's development integration. We need to have infrastructure programs in place that connect up our economies, and we need to actively cooperate to promote industrialization and industrial development. Those are the work streams that we're engaged in on the continent and within the regions that we're part of.
Looking at our emerging market partners, Minister, and in particular the tension that's playing itself out between the US and Russia right now, is this a source of concern for South Africa, and should it be a concern to us?
Well, I think that we have a number of partners, international partners, who may not all agree among themselves. I don't think that necessarily affects the partnership we have with each of them. So we are strong partners with Russia in the contents of the BRICS. We also have a strong partnership with the United States, and we are hoping and we are working towards the continuation and extension of our inclusion in the African Growth and Opportunity Act. I don't think the fact that the two of them have got differences over the Ukraine is necessarily a matter that affects us. We will also have the right as a sovereign state to take our own decisions about how we might vote in the United Nations on issues like the Ukraine. So I think those are just the way it works.
If the US is to come through with some of the threats that we've heard of putting down sanctions on Moscow, how does this impact on our trade with Russia and the US, if at all?
I don't think at this point in time there's any clear indication that it will have any discernible impact at all.
Let's look at, just for a moment, let's look at our local situation in particular with regards to the cost and availability of labor, which is, of course, one of the prerequisites that will improve or take away from our attractiveness as an investment destination. We see the platinum strike, Minister, headed quite strongly towards its 14th week now. Again, your reflection on the kind of dent this is making to the South African brand image.
Well, I think first of all, your point about the cost and availability of labour is the important one. What kind of labour do we need in South Africa? What kind of capacities do we need among the workforce? And as we industrialise, I think the key challenge is that we need a more skilled, more capable labour force. I mean, we have, I think, real capabilities among our workers, but we don't have enough skills. So the biggest challenge in the labour market, from where I sit, is to ensure that we have skills development, adequate training, and we tell all investors and all the serious investors that we know get involved in that. I think that's the fundamental challenge for us. There is an issue, of course, in the mining industry. There is an issue with the strike. We have, as government, repeatedly said that we want the parties to come together and find a solution sooner rather than later. I think it is having an impact on the way we perceive, but it doesn't sit in the kind of overwhelming category that I think some commentators in South Africa perhaps think it does. We continue to see investors from across the world who see the importance of investing in Africa, the importance of South Africa as the most industrialized country in the African continent, and the significance that South Africa has as a big player on the African continent in terms of what it offers as a potential gateway for their operations outside of our borders as well. So I think we continue to see an investment pipeline, particularly in value-added activities, which is holding up, and people are committed to continuing and strengthening their presence in the South African economy.
Minister, there has been talks about collaboration between South Africa and Nigeria, in particular in the auto manufacturing sector, which I'm quite certain is a welcome development in terms of improving the attractiveness of the continent as a whole. Let's talk a little bit about that and what ground has been covered in assisting Nigeria to develop its own auto manufacturing hub.
Well, the Nigerians are, as you indicate, now wanting to move into the creation of an auto sector. And they have noticed that we have an automotive industry, and they're interested in our program and learnings from our programs. And we've been sharing information with them because we support the idea that there should be an automotive industry in Nigeria. One of the ambitions that we have is that the Nigerian industry would start off with the manufacture of semi-knockdown kits. The assembly of semi-knockdown kits, and we're interested in exploring the possibility that South African factories would be producing the inputs into those. That's the kind of symbiotic relationship that we are seeking to build with Nigeria. But we do support the efforts of Nigeria, among other African countries, to industrialize. It's not just ourselves that are talking about industrialization. It's many other countries on the African continent, and indeed I think you will hear that the leaders of the continent as a whole are speaking about the need for this continent to industrialize. We've got to make structural changes in our economy. The Nigerians are very significant players in that, and we have some very useful conversations with Nigerian colleagues on precisely those issues. So we support Nigeria industrializing.
Final comments, Minister. We started off this interview with a reflection on the last 20 years. My question to you now is almost to look forward to another 20 years and the kind of structural changes that you think need to be made now for us to realize the South Africa and the Africa that we dream of.
Well, I think what we need to do now is we need to move much more energetically and effectively into value-added production. We need to drive that through a very ambitious infrastructure program. Those are the key policy directions that an incoming administration would be adopting. Those are the key highlights of our manifesto. And we will be drawing on localization and other policy instruments, and we will be fighting for the policy space that we need as South Africa, but the continent of Africa needs in international forums that will allow us and enable us to emerge as industrial players in our own right. That is our future, that's where it has to be, and that's where we are determined to take our country and our continent.
We've come to the end of this week's episode of Invest Africa. Thank you to my guest, Minister Rob Davies, who joined us from our studios in Cape Town, talking everything from democracy to industrial policy in the country, on the continent and globally. Well, Bruce Whitfield is up next as he unpacks the latest news from South Africa's economy on Tonight with Bruce. Until next time, it's goodbye and thank you for joining us.